welcome back to the main stage. I hope everyone had a great break and got to connect and chat in some of those Zoom breakout rooms. The next panel that we have is one that I'm really excited about, Building Back Better. We'll be looking at construction and infrastructure. So I'd like to welcome the moderator for this session, David LePage.
Great, thanks, Tori. And I'm kind of excited about this because construction is such an important topic, and in terms of social procurement, and all the conversation about the build back better after the pandemic is such an opportunity for how do we add social procurement into that discussion, and how do we emphasize social procurement in all the investment in infrastructure and in construction. Because I think when we add social procurement into the whole discussion of construction, we have this interesting conversation that we're not just building a physical structure, we're actually building community. So rather than just this idea that we're putting out an RFP or we're contracting someone to build a building, when we add a social value to that, we're actually helping to build community while we build the physical structure. So that physical structure becomes one part, but the job creation, the community involvement, the local buying, the apprenticeships, all those things are building community, and they can all be part of construction. And because I enjoy reading a lot about economies and economists, construction is also very interesting to me because there's this huge debate on government involvement in construction. And you have one group of people like the Friedman School that says, no, government shouldn't be touching this stuff. Just let the market go on its own and everything will be fine. And we have the other side, the Keynesian sort of story of like, these are great opportunities for government to look at how they can leverage this investment. And when we look at what the budget said last week from the federal government and the commitment over the last 3 or 4 years going forward, and what we know is going to happen, and what historically how construction has helped get economies and people back to work, we have a great opportunity now to leverage the devastation communities have had because of because of the COVID-19. And when we know there's going to be billions of dollars spent in construction, we're going to talk with our panel today, how can that really be effective? What are the tools? What are the concepts? What have they seen, and what do they see in the future? So let's just get right to the panel, and we'll just go around and ask everyone to introduce yourself, how you're coming at this, and how you see the role of construction and social procurement. Kumsa, let me start with you, okay?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon from Toronto. Hi, everyone. My name is Kumsa Bucker. I'm the Director of Community Benefit Campaigns at the Toronto Community Benefits Network. I see my work focused on the intersections of equity, advocacy, policy, and community development as it relates to infrastructure and community benefits. And when I talk about community benefits, I'm talking about the opportunities, like David mentioned, through physical infrastructure, the jobs that are created through apprenticeships, professional, administrative, technical positions, but also the purchasing of goods and services. And a lot of times I think about how can this be done equitably with commitments and targets to ensure that there are opportunities for those who have been left out of the economy, for those who are from underrepresented groups within the industry, as well as local communities who will most likely be most impacted by some of these projects. We also want to make sure that local businesses, diverse-owned businesses, and social enterprises, who are near these projects can also benefit from the purchasing of goods and services. And in a way, we're also strengthening our local economies as we roll out these infrastructure dollars. When I mention community benefits, it's also about the social benefits and infrastructure that can be captured through the physical development process. One of the areas that my organization has been involved in since 2014 has been transit development here in Toronto, where in 2014 we negotiated a community benefits framework with Metrolinx to ensure that as they were building out, the future of transit in our city, that there were commitments to equity, to local hiring, to purchasing goods and services from local businesses, as well as social enterprises, and additional community engagement to make sure that we are actually building strong neighborhoods that include improvements as well as environmental protections. On that project, the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, who the private sector developers Crosslinks Transit Solutions, they most recently reported that about approximately $800,000 have been spent on social enterprises. This is through purchasing of goods and services that are needed to help with this infrastructure development. And now that currently we also have the Finch West LRT project, which is currently underway, as well as 3 new transit projects that are currently in planning. So we have the Ontario line, the Eglinton West extension to the airport, as well as the Scarborough subway extension. And those 3 projects total over $20 billion in public money. And so we're really excited because we see this as a significant opportunity for this number to expand and for more social enterprises to be supported through these investment dollars. And it also expands to the wider community. So what we're seeing now is additional development of things like housing, of things like other types of infrastructure that are needed to support new communities that are being built. And so we want to make sure that, as we're developing learnings from some of these public infrastructure projects, that we can also apply them to maybe some of the private sector projects that will be coming along the way in the near future.
Thanks, Kumsa. I think that's a really valuable point, that whole idea that sometimes we look at these gigantic projects and people say, oh, where's the opportunity for a local subcontractor or a social enterprise? When you say $800,000 to social enterprises as a result of it, we sometimes have to break this down and look at where are the value opportunities. And because we've heard contractors and others say, oh, it's too big of a project, we can't participate. But I think the work that you're mentioning, how do you break it down? Really, really important. So we're going to go down the road a bit to London, Ontario. And Julie, can you give us a bit of background on what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Julie Forrester. I'm the manager of Impact Consulting, which is a charity-run consulting firm here in London, owned by Pillar Nonprofit Network. But I'm here today to talk more about my role on our leadership table for Inclusive Economy London. So we're a collaborative of about 30 charities, businesses, community advocates, and we've been working together for the last couple of years to bring forward principles of inclusive economy in London. So social procurement has really become a big part of our collaborative work over the last couple of years. We also do some work in cooperative development and living wage advocacy. But really, social procurement has kind of taken over a lot of our capacity in the movement and impact that we're already starting to see in London and in our community. So we've been kind of building out from scratch an ecosystem of social procurement, working with social enterprises. We have some amazing social enterprises. Many of them are part of our network. We've also been working with private purchasers. So we have a group that's coming together of anchor institutions. We're starting to work quite a bit with private construction contractors. I know we're going to talk about that because we've seen some significant movement on that side. And we've been doing our best to advocate with our municipality as well around some upcoming projects, including London's rapid transit project that's coming up in the next couple of years. So we've really been sort of pushing that narrative over the last couple of years. I think it's a newer one here in London, but trying to educate the community, bring forward, business tools and social procurement as a way to do community development. Similar to Kumsa, I think we come at it really from an equity and inclusion lens. Our collaborative is actually backboned by the London Poverty Research Centre, who's brought a lot of these conversations forward in London and helping keep them front of mind for our organizations. And so for us, it's really about a direct way to tackle wealth inequality and social justice issues through social procurement, living wage, cooperative development, and inclusive economic principles overall. So happy to be here, and thanks, David.
Thanks, Julie. I think we'll flip back now to the West Coast and have Matt round out the panel introductions and the project that you're working on, Matt.
Great, thanks very much, David. Good day, everyone. As David mentioned, I'm from the West Coast here of Canada at the city of Surrey. And for those who aren't familiar with Surrey, it's about 500,000 population, and it's growing very quickly at about 1,000 people per month. I've been an engineer at the city for about 15 years now, and most of the projects I'm involved with are related to utilities and flood control. And the project I'm leading right now is one to adapt to climate change and sea level rise over the next 7 to 8 years. And what's unique for the city is it has a large federal government contribution, $77 million of federal funding. And with that comes the requirement to meet community employment benefits. So as a technical person with an engineering background, all this language was new to me, and my journey started in 2018 when we started our funding application. And in 2018, there wasn't too much information from the federal government at that time about what community employment benefits would be, beyond that as an applicant, if we were successful, we would be required to report on them and to provide community employment benefits. So it's been a real learning journey for me since 2018. And I guess the opportunity for our city is this is the first time for the type of municipal construction that this project is involved with, such as building dikes, dams, ditches, pump stations, pipelines, sewers, that type of thing, roadworks. We're now starting to track what groups are participating in the economic activity. And as a city, we've committed to meeting a certain target for different groups and reporting those annually. And then what we're hoping in this project is that we'll see over the 6 or 7 years that as the capacity of the community increases, that we'll see a more inclusive economy in delivering the different projects.
Thanks, Matt. And I think what's interesting is, Matt, working with you and Tori and the city of Surrey, how amazed we were with how much value is already being created and how many small and medium-sized enterprises were already engaged. What was the goal that you set for the project?
Yeah, that was a tricky one to even figure out what number should we put out there as our initial target. So we picked 20 to 30% for the cumulative hours worked by the identified target groups by the federal government, and then half of our supply chain contracts to come from small and medium enterprise. So absolutely, David, we're impressed with what the data showed so far in the project. So about close to a quarter of the workforce being women, and over 10% being youth, as an example of some of the initial data. And so we're certainly within our original target. But one thing about our project is the front of the project tends to be more sort of office work and professional services. And then as the project moves more into the construction phase, the sort of demographics of the workforce will change. And so we want to keep track of how that changes with the life of the project.
Great. I think it's going to be wonderful to watch 8 years of progress and how we can evolve and how the businesses evolve, because we already are seeing that when you put out those RFQs, those requests for qualifications and the requests for procurement, the RFPs, is that it's generating conversation within the industry to say, okay, how do I do this? And over 8 years, lots of learning can go on. It's interesting, Julie, we know that you're also working on a construction project with the Children's Museum. Can you talk about that? Because that's kind of a unique community-driven one, as opposed to Matt's model, which is coming from, the Industry Canada mandate of the contract due community employment benefit, which is driving that. Kumsa's, you're within kind of a mandated transit community benefit. And Julie, yours is really kind of unique, I think, and really valuable to share.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's funny, as we were pushing to get, the big exciting projects that Matt and Kumsa are seeing in their communities, we had private sector clients coming forward and saying, well, the city isn't necessarily ready to do this yet. We're not seeing the movement we want to see there, but we'd like to do this. Just from sort of word of mouth conversations, people started referring, hey, you're interested in, impact on your construction project, you should talk to Inclusive Economy London. We heard they're doing some kooky things. And we said, yes, we are. We'd love to talk to you. And so through that, we were introduced to the London Children's Museum project. So they are moving into a new facility, actually renovating an old factory here in London, or a portion of it, and working with Michael Clark Construction, a local contractor. And they have really, stepped up to say, we'd like to do this, and not only on this project, but it's something that they're now looking at introducing to other, construction contracts that they're putting forward. So it's been interesting for us. I think we were almost sort of waiting for something to dig our teeth into. We'd been doing the education, we'd been learning a lot ourselves, and we were just waiting for something that we could dive into, and it didn't come from where we thought it was going to come from with transit projects or some of our larger anchor institutions. It came from some of these smaller construction contracts who are a little bit more nimble, a little bit more flexible, and certainly have an interest and have control over their projects in a different way than some of the government contracts and government funded contracts. So that's been easier, I think, to some extent, to move forward on this work. But also, how do we scale it up, and how do we continue to use these small successes to push for some of those larger procurement projects as well?
So that's fascinating, because that's like a construction company. We heard from Shandos, who's doing it on a voluntary, and this is a bit from not the construction side, but the owners, the Children's Museum, saying, we're in the nonprofit, saying, how do we do this? How do we contribute? Kumsa, what are you seeing as like the opportunities created in the model you're working with, where it's large transit, and are there some barriers that are in the way that if you could rewrite that CBA, or that or how you go forward? What are you trying to take an opportunity from, but what are you trying to fix?
Yeah, I would say here in Toronto, I think one of the successes that we've seen has really been the leadership from our local government. The City of Toronto, since about 2015, has, as part of the poverty reduction strategy, has included social procurement and community benefits as part of sort of an approach to addressing poverty here in Toronto. And so we've been really great to see from that a social procurement program be developed in 2016, and then subsequently the community benefits framework that was developed in 2019. And so I think being able to see that leadership from government, and initially it has been challenging. I wouldn't say it's been easy. For a long time, we only had one full-time staff dedicated to the work, and it takes a lot more than that, right? This is not going to be achieved with sort of work on the side of someone's desk. It's going to need investment, to ensure that, we have a strong coordinated system in place, that as these infrastructure dollars roll out, that there's a support in place to make sure that, those goals or those targets that are in place can be achieved. And so I would say that resources, I think, is very important and very critical. We've been lucky here in Toronto, after a lot of advocacy from our network, and coalition members, to go from 1 to 5 full-time staff now who are going to be supporting the community benefits work at the City of Toronto. That was passed just recently in January. And then it also takes coordination within government, right? We have many different divisions and agencies and corporations here at the city. And sort of that internal work is also really important. And so it's really been really great to see the sort of infrastructure side, speaking with the social development side that, handles a lot of the training, that's speaking to the procurement side, that's writing the tenders, and to make sure that all of those pieces are in place to make sure that we have a strong and successful program. And then in terms of like construction, a lot of the delivery of construction is through the private sector. And so, it's been really encouraging to hear Julie speak about the leadership of the private sector in London. And, we want to see more of that, here in Toronto, in terms of, the private sector, who are receiving, these public dollars, coming to the table, working collaboratively to help to develop programs for implementation that can help to support our local economies and strengthen our supply chains. And lastly, I would say it also is important to ensure that there's a strong, community that's ensuring that as sort of this work is being developed, that there are processes available to hold both government and the private sector accountable. It's not only about the CBA itself, but it's also ensuring that, how are those goals being achieved and who's monitoring that, and how can we make sure that community is part of that monitoring process so that, as we're building back differently, that we're actually measuring what success looks like so that we can, make improvements as we go.
Great, thanks. It's interesting, the different approaches that are trying to get at the same outcome, whether it's, Julie working with a collaborative around poverty reduction, Kumsa working in a framework designed by government. Matt, there's a question here from Sean Barnes, and Sean's actually joining us from New Zealand. You came at it as an engineer, and that's not the normal place where we see the first engagement with social procurement. So can you talk a bit about how you went through the conversation internally with your colleagues that kind of grew this to the impact it has the potential to produce?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think one thing to acknowledge is, as an engineer, is we work in a world of numbers. So having strong data to support our decision points as we move forward was really important to get my managers to buy into the project. But also beyond the engineering department, one thing we recognized from the outset was that we needed to involve all the different departments in the city. So kind of when we saw that we were getting close to receiving our kind of final approval from the federal government, is we set up a internal steering committee that involved someone from our legal services, from our procurement department, from the parks department, planning, and so on. And so we could kind of get everyone's buy-in and sort of build that base level of awareness and support for the initiative early on, before we were, in the crunch to actually issue contracts to deliver the construction. So I think that was really important to recognize that even though the work of satisfying our grant is very technical, how to build a dam, how to build a bridge, that type of thing, but getting that interdepartmental support and buy-in was really helpful to get going. And then just more specifically to Sean's question, we found that a lot of the professional services, they very carefully track their time, because that's how they're charging the client, is by the number of hours worked. But most of them didn't have a good awareness of actually what groups the different employees represented from an equity perspective. So there was a fair bit of kind of startup to get the different consultants set up to be able to report that information to the city. So it's been a really, it's been rewarding to see that how far we've come, and sort of now that's a very routine thing now, is for the different consulting firms to know sort of what percentage of different employment categories their company represents at this point.
Yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating, because you're all talking about significant stakeholder engagement. Julie, do you want to describe like who's involved in making that your coalition work, but also in terms of the museum? What's going to have to happen in terms of that stakeholder buy-in to be successful?
Yeah, I could say it takes a village. Is that yeah, I think at the collaborative level, it's been great to see Mike Corey from the London Poverty Research Center step up as the full-time, manager to run not just our social procurement, but also our living wage and our cooperative action tables. So that's how our volunteer groups are organized, particularly around community benefits and social procurement. There is a larger sort of collaborative who has been helping to host educational sessions. So we hosted a series of 4 information sessions, and that helped gather about 30 individuals from private sector, public sector. We did have some city staff and some other nonprofit groups and employment agencies attend. And so now we have sort of this group who is educated, on board, and are planning together what they want their next steps as a collaborative around community benefits. So the beginnings of community benefits action table or community benefits network. And on the side, we've been working on these specific pilot projects to move, to be able to tell some stories back to that group to help, fuel the fire of energy that group has. So within the private sector contracts, we really work with the client to identify, their specific goals. So we're trying to tailor their social procurement and their impact goals to the project, to the organization. So for the Children's Museum, obviously there's a large youth component, and how do we engage youth, but even children in the design process, in community engagement sessions. How do they engage youth on the projects and in the building? And what's nice is there's a really clear alignment between that and the construction contractor who already works with a youth social enterprise, already has interest in engaging youth in apprenticeships and working with vulnerable youth. So it worked out nicely that there was already some connections there and a shared value set. But I think that's been one of the most important things, is creating a shared value set and a shared impact goal and some measurement system that they want to use, because it isn't outlined by an Industry Canada contract. It isn't outlined by a municipal policy. It's outlined by what the client and the contractor want to achieve together. So it's a bit more of a discussion. And we're also, we chatted about this last week, David, going to be working more with the contractor's staff as well. So it's less of just at the management level, but how do we change the culture so that this is embedded into their RFP processes? How do we work with their suppliers? So the ripple effect of a couple pilot projects is hopefully going to be more inroads within the construction industry in London, so that conversations like this do become more commonplace. As Matt said, it takes a lot of upfront work to put the systems of measurement and tracking, but even just asking the questions at the beginning and helping organizations report on that, hopefully when our municipal infrastructure projects do start tracking and implementing community benefits, our construction companies and our industry is going to be ready and well prepared and have already gone through that process with some of these great private sector projects.
Yeah, it's a great great model of the incremental development. And I think of the Vancouver model, where it really kind of went back and forth, project to project, but none of that continuity that in the learning exclusively that you're building in purposefully. We had experiments with a casino and the Olympics and a casino, and now we have a policy. And a key part of that policy, what I think is so effective, is that it actually has brought together a very a cross-sector advisory committee that is actually includes developers and builders, community partners, etc. So that stakeholder engagement, again, that you're talking about, was quite important. There's a question in the chat box about how do CBAs exclude people. I think there's a misconception that what the province of British Columbia put out as a community benefit agreement, that's really an employee development project. And it is not designed as what we would refer to as a community benefit agreement, which is a component of the purchasing process. So Kumsa, can you kind of just talk about how that multi-stakeholder engagement has actually encouraged participation in the production?
Yeah, here in Toronto, our community benefit agreements are really focused in working closely with community, labor, government, and the private sector to all come to the table. And so as part of every community benefits agreement, there is a working group that has each of those stakeholders at the table who are working collaboratively to develop a program for implementation that looks at everything from recruitment to hiring to retention and to also reporting on those outcomes. And so we've been able to see some really successful outcomes by having sort of all of these stakeholders at the table and also to discuss issues, right? Because I think some of the learnings from our first Eglinton Crosstown LRT project where we were involved in has really informed some of the current and new models for CBAs that we're developing. And so I think a lot of that is developed because there is all stakeholders that are at the table who are discussing some of the challenges and issues when it comes to implementation, but also being very solution oriented and really focused on what are ways that we can identify a solution to make sure that we're meeting the goals that we've set out to.
And in those meeting those objectives and solutions, there's a question in the chat box. What are some of the considerations that you would recommend to like the smaller businesses, right? Because I know that was a challenge for you at one point and you've worked through it. So some advice for others on how to include those, like you said, $800,000 to social enterprises and other small businesses too, right?
Yeah, I would say like a lot of times like it could be very daunting when it comes to some of these large scale infrastructure projects. And so what we do is we work closely with like the client owner, right? And so with Metrolinx, what we've been able to do is partner with them to do social procurement fairs, right? Where we create a space for some of the procurement managers to be in a space with some of the smaller suppliers or businesses or social enterprises to learn more about what are the goods and services that they typically purchase. Could there be an opportunity for alignment with maybe with some of the businesses that are in attendance, and then with some of the smaller companies even themselves, if they're interested in doing community benefits, even if it's hiring one person, I think like there's definitely additional value that can be developed from working both at the larger scale and seeing ways where some of those contracts can be broken down so that it's more accessible. And then also, with some of those smaller businesses where we know that they may have a stronger local connection, in the community level to help support them with, folks who've identified, that they're interested in getting an opportunity, through a job.
Great, thanks. Matt, if you're going to try to reach a goal of 50% of the contracts going to small and medium-sized businesses, does that the contracts in the city, or is that the supply chain? So what thoughts should small businesses in the Lower Mainland have with this 8-year project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we chose to make that goal based on the direct contracts we award, but also that second tier of contracts that are then subcontracted. And so we didn't go too far into the weeds. We put a floor tracking anything over $50,000 to focus on more the larger picture items. So yeah, it varies quite a lot by job, the type of subcontractors and trades that are involved with each project. And I think as we start to issue contracts to deliver this project, those conversations are going to develop. To be honest, I think in this first round where we're at right now is the general contractors have looked at their distribution of labor on their payroll, but kind of drilling down to the next level of their subcontracts, that's going to just be evolving as work unfolds. And as the city, we can play a bit of a matchmaking role where if contractors are finding their past business relationships are with contractors that aren't meeting the community employment benefit targets. That's where as the city we can help make referrals or just connect groups and social enterprises and companies that have a track record of meeting community employment benefits with the specific general contractor. So I think really it's just in the beginning stages, David, and we'll watch that carefully as it unfolds.
So Julie, you talked about including youth. Can you give us an idea of, like, in the ecosystem in your region, what are some of those opportunities for those smaller businesses, and what are you seeing emerge when you look at, like, I think the Children's Museum is a several $1 million. It's not a $1 billion project, but it's going to have an impact. What are some of the opportunities that you've discussed with the construction to be more inclusive as you're trying to address the issues you are?
Yeah, so I'll give a fairly vague answer because we're just starting to dive into that on this project and some other projects that we're working on, actually looking at, okay, what is going into the RFPs, where the dollars being spent on these specific projects, and where do we see opportunities for youth and businesses, diverse-owned businesses as well. So we have a couple targets around that that we haven't dived into too many specifics. So this will be my vague answer, but specifically around youth, there is a youth opportunities unlimited social enterprise here that already does catering, recycling. There have in the past been construction-related social enterprises that work with youth and people who have experienced barriers to employment. So we're starting to connect with some of those existing social enterprises, as well as Goodwill Industries that has a number of different social enterprise projects. So we're essentially, to start with, connecting with existing social enterprises to identify where can they meet the needs within these projects. And then we're going to take a wider lens of, are there pieces within this that either those social enterprise companies or potentially new companies that are formed or new social enterprises might be able to fill some specific gaps. So I liked the example earlier of housing. We've been in some conversations with housing development corporations as well to identify, should we develop a social enterprise that might be able to fill the needs. We did some work with Canadian Mental Health Association a couple of years ago to look at bed bug removal as an example of something that they are already purchasing, and a number of other housing associations in the community are already purchasing those services. Is there an opportunity to actually develop a bed bug removal company that is run by people who are living or transitioning out of CMHA housing? So really getting into sort of the nitty-gritty of what are some specific either short-term infrastructure or potentially some long-term social enterprises that might come from these projects.
And I think that ripple effect of opportunity. Kumsa, are you familiar enough with the window washing project to tell that story?
Not too much, but I do know that that came out of the Eglinton Crosstown LRT with a lot of the construction and impact to businesses along the route. And, from that, the idea of window washing, right? And we have a really great social enterprise here in Toronto called Building Up, who's able to offer, services, within that space and to help support with that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because, as Matt said, the learning that's going to happen. I don't think window washing was in the original RFQ when it went out for bid. And it was one of those opportunities that when you put in a social value consideration, someone's going to think, like, who can do that? Can we just find a social enterprise? So we've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to go around. We'll do Matt and Julie and Kumsa. If you were starting or recommending or advising someone who's going into a major construction project, what would be 2 or 3 key things that they should keep in mind as they build out the social value opportunities? Matt, do you want to start?
For sure. So yeah, I would say start small, but start strategic. And so think about what's going to help get to the next step in the process of developing community employment benefits. So for the example of Surrey, we consciously decided to get our mayor and council buy-in to say, look, this is very exciting, this federal funding possibility that we're applying for, but how are we going to meet the community employment benefits requirement that comes with that money? And so getting that support from the top down at the outset that, yes, we want to raise the bar here, that we want to be proactive and provide those community employment benefits was really helpful to get going. And then one just quick takeaway is to build these ripples of effect. I think no matter how small a step a municipality or owner takes, putting that information on the website makes a huge difference, because then the next time another community is facing the same challenge, a quick Google search, community employment benefits, will start to show how many different municipalities in Canada are moving forwards on this, and it makes it that much easier for the next jurisdiction to take the next step forwards to advance this type of work.
Great. Julie, some advice?
I think one of my biggest learnings, I don't know if it's great advice, is sharing your story early. One of the things that has been a hesitation for me in some of these projects has been, how early can we start talking about the community benefits work that we're doing as we're still figuring it out? So I think, as you said, Matt, get the word out. It doesn't have to be perfect. Start doing something. The other piece I would say is building relationships early. All of the progress and movement that we've seen has been through, word of mouth, relationships. It's been part of our network that wasn't necessarily where we thought projects were going to come forward, or where collaborations or where social enterprises were going to come forward and say, hey, I can do window washing, or, we have this project at the museum. All of that was sort of spontaneous from talking about community benefits and saying, we'd like to do this. Are you interested? How do you want to be a part of it?
Great. Kumsa, you have the last minute.
Sorry, just on mute there. Yeah, lastly, I would say, if we're going to be serious about, building back better, building back differently, I think there needs to be strong commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think we need to have a strong framework in place to monitor and evaluate those outcomes with disaggregated data. Looking from some of the recent labor force survey data, we're seeing unemployment rates, higher for racialized Canadians. I think 20.1% for Southeast Asians, 16.4% for Black Canadians, 16.6% for Latin Americans, and we've also in the construction industry, on the flip side, we've also heard about impending shortage of skilled workers, right? And so I think that, there's a really great opportunity to bridge that gap. The recent budget from the federal government, we heard additional supports for employers. I think they're up $5,000 for all first-year apprenticeships to help employers to pay some of the upfront costs, and an additional $5,000 for employers who hire those from underrepresented groups. And I think this financing, that is going towards employers. I think there could be an opportunity to also maybe see how social enterprises, who do, in my opinion, a much more important role in doing the outreach, doing the recruitment, doing all of the training, all the wraparound supports. And I think very similarly, I think social enterprises can be in a good place to receive similar type funding to make sure that, we're prepared for that next generation of builders to help support with our infrastructure.
Great. I want to thank all of you. We're right on time. And I think it's important, as we talked about, building will never be the same when we start to think about it as a means to not just construction, but building community. And I think all of you are making tremendous contributions to that concept. And as Matt and others have said, is just start talking about it, and it's building, and it's great. So Julie, you have to pick a number between 1 and I think 200. We have a copy of Sean Lonnie's book for the next prize, An Army of Problem Solvers. So Tori will be able to give that out if you give the number.
I will go early. I'll pick number 3.
Okay, so number 3, and now we're going to move to the main stage and pass it over to Tori and crew.